On a Tuesday morning in March of 2019, a man named Garrett Sievert stood in the middle of his dealership's service bay in Platte County, Nebraska, and watched what he was certain was the end of a very expensive problem. The John Deere 8370R on the lift had been there for 11 days. 11 days of diagnostic readouts, software patches, and phone calls to technical support lines in 3 different states. The tractor belonged to a farmer named Delmar Borgman, and it had stopped working in the middle of a field during pre-plant tillage, and now it sat in Garrett Sievert's bay like a monument to everything that was supposed to be impossible with modern equipment. Garrett was 38 years old, had run the dealership for 6 years after buying out his former employer, and had built his reputation on the idea that he could fix anything with a current software license and a factory-trained technician. He had 2 of those technicians. He had the software. He had 11 days. The tractor had not moved. Let me tell you about the tractor first, because you need to understand what it was before you can understand what happened to it. The John Deere 8370R is not a simple machine. It is, in many respects, a rolling computer with wheels attached. It weighs approximately 36,000 pounds when ballasted for field work, produces 370 horsepower at the engine, and runs through a continuously variable transmission that is controlled not by a mechanical linkage, but by a software system that interprets sensor data and adjusts power delivery in real time. The machine Delmar Borgman had purchased 18 months earlier had cost him $312,000 after trade-in on his previous tractor, and it had worked perfectly for 1 full season before it stopped. Not slowly, not with warning. It stopped in the middle of a field on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, and when Delmar climbed down from the cab and called the dealership, the first thing Garrett Sievert said was that he would send a technician out with a diagnostic laptop, and this would probably take about 2 hours to sort out. That had been 11 days ago. The diagnostic tool told them the tractor had a fault in the Integrated Emission Control Unit, which was the system that managed the selective catalytic reduction system, which was the system that controlled the diesel exhaust fluid injection, which was the system that kept the machine compliant with emissions regulations. The fault code was CF000, which in the John Deere diagnostic software meant a complete controller failure. The software recommended replacement of the IECU module. Garrett ordered the module. It arrived in 4 days. His technician installed it. The tractor threw the same code. The software recommended a full ECU reflash. They performed the reflash. The tractor threw the same code. The software recommended replacement of the DEF dosing unit. Garrett ordered it. 2 days for delivery. His technician installed it. The tractor threw the same code. At this point, Garrett had spent $14,000 in parts and labor on a tractor that was not his, and Delmar Borgman was calling him every morning at 7:30, and planting season was moving closer like a wall. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When you have a machine worth $312,000 that is controlled by software, and the software tells you the machine is broken, and you replace every part the software tells you to replace, and the machine is still broken, at what point do you stop trusting the software? Garrett Sievert's answer on the morning of day 11 was that he had not yet reached that point. He was on the phone with a John Deere regional technical specialist in Des Moines who was telling him to order a 3rd module, a CAN bus gateway controller, which would arrive in 3 days and cost $2,800, and Garrett was writing down the part number. He did not hear the truck pull into the lot. He did not hear the boots on the concrete. He heard the voice. "You check the ground straps." Garrett turned around. Standing at the edge of the service bay with his hands in the front pocket of a canvas work coat that had seen 30 years of Nebraska winters was a man named Emmett Huber. Emmett was 67 years old. He had farmed 640 acres in Platte County for 41 years on land his father had broken before him, and his father before that. He was not Garrett Sievert's customer. He had never been Garrett Sievert's customer. He drove a 1987 Ford pickup with 214,000 miles on it, and he bought his parts from a catalog. And the last time he had purchased a piece of new equipment from any dealership in Platte County was 1998. He had a face that looked like it had been left outside for most of those 41 years, and his hands, the ones tucked into the front of that canvas coat, were the hands of a man who had rebuilt engines in unheated shops in January. Let me tell you about Emmett Huber, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Emmett was not a complainer. He was not the kind of man who showed up at coffee shops to tell younger farmers what they were doing wrong. He watched. He listened. He had been watching Garrett Sievert's service bay for 11 days because his farm shared a property line with the dealership's back lot, and he could see the 8370R from his shop window, and he had watched it sit there without moving, and he had watched the technicians come and go with their laptops, and he had said nothing. For 11 days he had said nothing, but on the morning of day 11, he had driven his 1987 Ford across the property line and into the service bay, and he had asked about the ground straps. Garrett Sievert looked at him. He was still holding the pen with the part number on it. "I'm sorry?" "Your ground straps," Emmett said again. He was looking at the tractor, not at Garrett. "On a machine like that, you've got chassis grounds running to the ECU and the emissions controller both. They're braided copper, about as thick as your thumb. They run from the frame rail to the controller housing. You check those?" Garrett put the phone down. He looked at his technician, a 26-year-old named Tyler who had his John Deere certification and had never worked on a tractor that didn't have a USB port. Tyler looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. "Because," Emmett continued, still looking at the tractor, "what you're describing sounds like a ground fault to me. Controller reads a voltage drop on the feedback circuit, throws a fault code, software tells you the controller's bad. But the controller's not bad. The ground is bad. You replace the controller, the ground's still bad. The new controller throws the same code. You can replace controllers all day." The silence in the service bay lasted about 4 seconds. Then Garrett Sievert said, "Our diagnostic software would flag a ground fault." Emmett turned and looked at him for the first time. His expression did not change. "Would it?" Let me tell you about what happened in the next few minutes, because this is where the story really begins. Garrett Sievert was not a stupid man. He had run a successful dealership for 6 years. He had factory training, manufacturer support, and a regional technical specialist on the phone. But he had spent 11 days looking at a screen that told him what was wrong, and the screen had not once mentioned the ground straps, and so the ground straps had not been checked. This is not a criticism of Garrett. This is a description of what happens when a diagnostic system is built to identify component failures and is not built to identify the failures that cause the components to fail. The software was looking at the controllers. Nobody had looked at the wires. Emmett walked over to the tractor without being invited. He pulled a flashlight from his coat pocket. Not a phone flashlight, a real flashlight, a heavy aluminum one that had probably been in that coat pocket for 15 years, and he crouched down beside the left frame rail and shone the light up along the chassis. He was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Come look at this." Garrett and Tyler both crouched down beside him. In the beam of the flashlight, running from the frame rail up to the emissions controller housing, was a braided copper ground strap. It was connected at both ends. It looked, to Garrett's eye, completely intact. He started to say so. Then Emmett touched the strap at the frame rail connection, and it moved. Not the strap, the terminal. The terminal rotated freely on the bolt, which meant the bolt was not tight, which meant the connection had been loose, which meant the ground circuit had been intermittent, which meant every fault code the diagnostic software had thrown for 11 days had been, in Emmett's word, a ghost. "Corrosion under the terminal," Emmett said. He was using a thumbnail to scrape at the bolt head, and a fine gray powder was coming off it. "Frame rail's got some surface rust here. Terminal's been sitting on rust instead of bare metal. You've got maybe 15% of the ground connection you need. Computer thinks the controller's failed because it's reading voltage drop on the feedback signal. Controller's fine. Your ground's corroded." He stood up. He put the flashlight back in his pocket. 40-cent problem, he said. "Now let me pause here and ask you something, because this moment is worth sitting with. 11 days. $14,000 in parts and labor. A regional technical specialist in Des Moines on hold. A $2,800 part on order. And a 67-year-old farmer who had never owned a tractor with a USB port had walked in off the property next door and found the problem in 30 seconds with a flashlight and a thumbnail. I want you to think about what that means. Not about Garrett Sievert's competence, because Garrett was not incompetent. Think about what it means that the system, the diagnostic software, the factory training, the technical support infrastructure, had been designed to find the wrong thing. It had been designed to find failed components. It had not been designed to find failed connections. And Emmett Huber, who had spent 41 years fixing things with his hands before he knew what was wrong with them, had been designed, by experience, by necessity, by 40 years of fixing equipment in a county where the nearest dealer was 40 miles away, to find exactly that. Tyler went to the parts shelf and found a wire brush, a tube of dielectric grease, and a new M10 bolt with a star washer. The repair took 22 minutes. Emmett stood to the side and watched without saying anything else. When Tyler reconnected the battery and climbed into the cab and turned the key, the tractor started. He put it in gear. It moved. He cycled through the diagnostic menu on the cab display. No fault codes. The 8370R, which had been declared essentially dead by 2 technicians, a diagnostic laptop, and a regional technical specialist over the course of 11 days, was running perfectly because a 67-year-old farmer had tightened a bolt and cleaned a terminal. Garrett Sievert stood in his service bay and looked at the tractor for a long moment. Then he looked at Emmett. "How did you know to look there?" Emmett shrugged. It was a small shrug, the kind that means the answer is obvious, but the speaker is too polite to say so. "Had a 402, do something similar in 94. Different fault, same cause. Voltage-sensitive systems don't like bad grounds. Didn't matter if it was a 1969 tractor or a 2017 one. Electricity works the same way it always did." Let me tell you about Emmett Huber's shop, because you need to understand the place before you can understand the man who came out of it. The shop sat at the back of Emmett's farmstead on a concrete pad that his father had poured in 1961, and it was a building that looked from the outside like it might collapse if you leaned against it too hard. The roof had been patched in 3 places with sheet metal that didn't quite match. The doors were the old swing-out type, hung on hand-forged hinges that Emmett had made himself on a leg vise that was older than he was. But inside, the shop was something else entirely. Inside, the shop was organized with the precision of a man who had learned that the cost of not knowing where something was could be measured in hours, and hours in a farming operation could be measured in acres, and acres in dollars, and dollars in whether you made it through the year. Every tool had a place. Every part had a bin, and along the north wall, on a set of shelves that ran floor to ceiling, was a collection that most people in Platte County either didn't know about or had dismissed as the hobby of an eccentric old man. Emmett Huber had been collecting automotive and agricultural electrical diagrams, service manuals, and wiring schematics since 1978. Not digitally, on paper. He had binders, hundreds of them, organized by manufacturer and year, going back to the 1940s. He had factory service manuals for tractors that hadn't been manufactured in 50 years. He had wiring diagrams for combines, grain dryers, irrigation pumps, and hay balers spanning 7 decades of agricultural equipment. He had, in a flat file drawer in the corner, original engineering drawings for a 1953 Oliver 88 that he had obtained from a retired Oliver engineer at a farm show in 1991. He had built this collection not because he was a collector in the hobbyist sense, but because he was a farmer who had learned early that the difference between fixing something and not fixing something was usually whether you understood how it was supposed to work. And he had extended that principle over 41 years to cover every piece of equipment he might conceivably encounter. The 8370R was not in his collection, but the principles were. The principles were always in the collection because the principles don't change. Voltage drop, ground resistance, feedback circuit logic. The 8370R's emissions controller was looking for a reference voltage from the chassis ground, and when the ground resistance was too high, the voltage was too low, and the controller interpreted that as a hardware failure and threw a fault code. This was not a new phenomenon. Emmett had seen it in a 1969 John Deere 4020, in a 1984 Case EH 2594, in a 1997 New Holland TR 98 combine. The specific controller was different. The fault code language was different. The underlying electrical behavior was identical. 40 years of reading wiring diagrams had given Emmett Huber a mental model of how electricity moves through machines that no diagnostic software had yet been written to replicate, because the software was written to identify what was broken, and Emmett had learned to understand why things broke. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in the service bay. Garrett Sievert called Delmar Borgman that morning and told him the tractor was ready. Delmar came and picked it up and drove it back to his field and finished his tillage, and he was only 12 days behind schedule, which in a Nebraska spring is not nothing but is also not catastrophic. Garrett refunded him for 2 of the 3 modules that had been replaced unnecessarily, which cost the dealership $9,400. He did not refund the labor. He did not refund the first module, which had been installed before the ground fault was identified and which he argued, not entirely without justification, may have had a secondary issue. Delmar accepted this arrangement without enthusiasm. The $2,800 CAN bus gateway controller that had been on order arrived 3 days later and went back to the distributor. Garrett Sievert, to his credit, did not try to pretend the previous 11 days had not happened. He called Emmett Huber that afternoon, not to thank him exactly, or rather, not only to thank him, but because he had a question that had been bothering him since the moment the tractor started. "How do you find something the software doesn't flag?" he asked. Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You start from the beginning, not from the fault code, from how the circuit is supposed to work. You ask what the controller needs to function correctly, and then you check whether it has those things in order before you start replacing the controller." Garrett wrote this down. He was not sure at the time what to do with it. Now, let me tell you about the conversation that happened at the Platte County Farm Bureau meeting 3 weeks later, because this is where the story gets more complicated. Garrett Sievert was not a man who kept his failures to himself, which was, in its way, a virtue. He told the story at the meeting. The 11 days, the $14,000, the 67-year-old farmer with the flashlight, partly because it was instructive and partly because he thought the farmers in the room should know that their diagnostic systems had limitations. What he did not anticipate was the response from a man named Buck Crowley. Buck Crowley was 59 years old and had been the senior John Deere territory manager for central Nebraska for 22 years. He was the kind of man who wore a pressed shirt to a Farm Bureau meeting and sat in the front row and had an opinion about everything and the confidence to deliver it at volume. He had sold Delmar Borgman his 837 OR. He had, in fact, sold a significant portion of the high horsepower equipment in Platte County over the past 2 decades, and he regarded himself, with some justification, as an authority on modern agricultural machinery. When Garrett finished his story, Buck Crowley leaned back in his chair and smiled the smile of a man who has already decided what he thinks before the other person finishes talking. "That's a nice story," he said, "but let me push back on the lesson you're drawing from it. One corroded ground strap doesn't mean the diagnostic systems don't work. It means somebody didn't torque a bolt at the factory. That's a QC issue, not a systems issue. The diagnostic software found the right fault location, the emissions controller circuit. It just couldn't tell you whether the problem was the controller or the connection. That's a sensor limitation, not a software failure. And the idea that we should be training technicians to go back to checking every wire by hand on a machine with 300 sensors and 40 control modules, that's not a solution. That's a step backward." The room was quiet. Garrett started to respond. Buck Crowley wasn't finished. "With respect to the gentleman who found the problem, and I'm sure he's a fine farmer, the reason we have diagnostic systems is so that we don't have to rely on whoever happens to walk in off the neighboring property. That's not a business model. That's luck. The answer here is better software, more sensor coverage, not pulling old-timers out of retirement to wiggle wires." Let me tell you about that laugh, because Buck Crowley laughed after he said it, and the laugh is worth examining. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who is certain he is right and who finds the alternative mildly absurd. It was the laugh of a person who has built a career on a particular model of how things work, and who experiences challenges to that model not as information, but as noise. Buck Crowley had sold $40 million worth of precision agricultural equipment in the past decade. He had sat through 47 manufacturer training seminars. He had a plaque on his office wall from Deere, recognizing him as the top territory manager in the region for 2017. He was not, by any reasonable measure, an uninformed man, but he had spent 22 years selling systems that were supposed to eliminate the need for the kind of knowledge Emmett Huber had, and he had, somewhere along the way, started to believe that they had. Emmett Huber was not at the Farm Bureau meeting. He had not been to a Farm Bureau meeting in 11 years. He was, at that moment, in his shop, rebuilding the hydraulic pump on his 1987 Ford, which had developed a slow leak that he intended to address before it became a fast leak. He did not know what Buck Crowley had said about him. He would not have cared particularly if he had. He had fixed the tractor. The tractor ran. That was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. But it was not the end of it. Let me tell you about the summer of 2019 in Platte County, Nebraska, because it was not a normal summer. It was a wet spring, followed by a hot June, followed by a July that was dry in a way that cracked the ground along the fence lines. And then, in August, a series of thunderstorms that came through the county and dropped hail on 3 separate occasions in 3 separate parts of the county. And the combination of all of this meant that it was a hard year for equipment. Equipment that sat in wet fields in May got mud in places mud had no business being. Equipment that ran hard in the July heat ran hot. And equipment that got caught in hailstorms got dented and cracked and, in several cases, had cab electronics damaged by water intrusion through seals that the hail had compromised. By September, Garrett Sievert's service bay had a waiting list. He had 4 machines in the bay and 6 more in the lot waiting their turn, and his 2 certified technicians were working 10-hour days and falling further behind. 3 of the machines in the bay had electronic faults that the diagnostic software was struggling with. One was a Fendt 1050 Vario with a transmission control module fault that had resisted 3 software updates and a module replacement. One was a case YH8250 combined with an intermittent header height control failure that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. One was a New Holland T 8.435 with a fault in the automatic steering system that the diagnostic software attributed to the GPS receiver, but replacing the GPS receiver had not resolved it. Garrett called Emmett Huber on a Thursday morning in the second week of September. He did not call to ask for help, exactly. He called to ask a question. "I've got a Fendt with a transmission fault," he said. "Software says TCM failure. I've replaced the TCM twice. I've got a case combine with an intermittent header fault. Software says it's the height sensor. I've replaced the sensor. Still intermittent. I've got a New Holland with a steering fault. Software says GPS receiver. Replaced it. Still faulting. Do any of those sound familiar to you?" Emmett was quiet for a moment. "The Fendt," he said. "What's the fault code?" "A 0816.04. Transmission output, speed sensor signal implausible. Check the speed sensor harness where it routes past the PTO housing. On those machines, the harness has a tendency to chafe on the housing bracket in the first 2 years. You'll see the insulation worn through. Might be intermittent. Only shorts when the harness flexes under load. The case combine. Header height control intermittent. What conditions does it fail in? Hot, cold, wet, dry?" Garrett checked his notes. "Technician says it seems to happen more when the machine has been running for a couple of hours. Not at startup. Thermal issue. Check the header height control relay in the cab fuse panel. Those relays have a known issue with the contact resistance increasing as they heat up. Ohm. Hit when it's cold. Ohm. Hit when it's hot. After it's been running 2 hours. You'll see the difference. The New Holland steering. GPS receiver was probably fine. Steering faults on those machines when the software says GPS, check the CAN bus termination resistors first. There are 2 of them, one at each end of the high-speed CAN bus. If either one drifts out of spec, you get intermittent communication errors that the software reads as GPS receiver failure. They're $4 resistors. Garrett wrote all of this down. He sent Tyler to the fent first. The harness was chafed through, exactly where Emmett had said. The repair took 40 minutes. The fent left the bay that afternoon. He sent his other technician, a man named Marcus, who had been with the dealership for 4 years, to the Case Combine with an ohmmeter. The relay read 0.3 ohms cold. After 2 hours of running, it read 4.7 ohms. A new relay cost $12. The Combine left the bay the next morning. The New Holland took a little longer because the CAN bus termination resistors were in an awkward location behind the instrument cluster. But when Marcus found them, one of them read 118 ohms instead of the specified 120, a drift of less than 2%, invisible to the diagnostic software, sufficient to cause intermittent communication errors on a high-speed data bus. The resistor cost $4. The New Holland left the bay on a Friday. 3 machines. 3 problems the diagnostic software had misidentified or missed entirely. 3 solutions that required not a software subscription or a factory-trained certification or a $2,800 module, but a flashlight, an ohmmeter, and 40 years of understanding how electricity moves through machines. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What is the value of that knowledge, not in the abstract, in dollars? Garrett Sievert had, over the course of that summer, spent approximately $22,000 on parts that had not fixed the problems they were installed to fix, plus the labor to install them, plus the time those machines spent in his bay instead of in the field. The 3 problems Emmett identified over the phone cost a combined total of $16 in parts and less than 3 hours of labor. The knowledge that identified those problems had been accumulated over 41 years of farming in Platte County, Nebraska, at a cost of what? The cost of paying attention. The cost of reading service manuals when other people were watching television. The cost of refusing to throw away a machine until you understood why it had stopped working. Let me tell you about the conversation Garrett Sievert had with Emmett Huber in October of 2019, because it is the conversation that changed something. Not in Emmett. Emmett did not change. In Garrett. He drove out to Emmett's farm on a Saturday morning with a check for $800, which was what he calculated Emmett's time was worth at his standard shop labor rate for the 3 phone consultations. Emmett looked at the check and then looked at Garrett and said he didn't want it. Garrett said he was going to leave it anyway. Emmett said he'd use it to buy parts for the County 4-H equipment restoration program, which he had been running out of his shop for 12 years. Teaching high school kids to rebuild carburetors and rewire harnesses on donated antique machinery. Garrett said that was fine. They stood in Emmett's shop for a while. Garrett was looking at the binders on the north wall. He pulled one out, a John Deere service manual from 1972, the kind with the green cover and the hand-drawn circuit diagrams inside. He leafed through it. The diagrams were clean and logical in a way that the software flowcharts in his factory training materials were not. Everything was visible. Every wire was labeled. Every connection was shown. You could trace a circuit from the battery to the load and back and understand completely what was supposed to happen and therefore what had gone wrong. He put the binder back. "The software isn't wrong," Emmett said. He had been watching Garrett look at the binders. "It's just looking at the wrong level. It looks at whether a component is functioning. It doesn't look at whether the component has what it needs to function. Those are different questions." Garrett nodded. He had been thinking about this for months. How do you train somebody to ask the second question? Emmett thought about this for a moment. "You make them fix things that don't have the first question answered for them," he said. "You give them a machine that's broken and no fault code, and you make them figure it out. You do that enough times, and eventually they stop waiting for the software to tell them what to look at." Garrett drove back to the dealership and sat in his office for a while. Then he called his 2 technicians in and told them that on Saturday mornings, starting in 2 weeks, they were going to be at Emmett Huber's shop, and Emmett was going to teach them something. Tyler looked uncertain. Marcus looked interested. Garrett told them it wasn't optional. "Let me tell you about those Saturday mornings, because they became something that nobody had planned for them to become." Emmett started with basics, not condescendingly. He had assessed correctly that both Tyler and Marcus understood electronics in the abstract, but had never developed the habit of physical verification. They knew what a ground strap was supposed to do. They had never thought to check whether it was doing it. He started with an ohmmeter and a piece of wire and a battery, and he showed them what resistance looked like in a healthy circuit and what it looked like in a corroded one, and he showed them how a small increase in resistance at a ground connection could create a voltage drop that a microcontroller would interpret as a sensor failure. He did this not with a PowerPoint presentation, but with actual wire and actual corrosion and an actual meter, and he made them measure it themselves. Then he moved to machines. He had, in the back of his shop, a 1978 John Deere 424.0 that he used for light field work and that he had been maintaining for 22 years. He had also, over the years, accumulated a collection of broken components, sensors, relays, switches, solenoids, that he had pulled from machines he had repaired, and he used these to create faults in the 424.0 that Tyler and Marcus had to find without a diagnostic laptop. He would install a failing relay in the hydraulic circuit and tell them the hydraulics were intermittent, and let them figure out why. He would create a high-resistance ground on the fuel system and tell them the engine was running rough and let them work through it. He would disconnect one wire in the charging circuit and let them find it with a voltmeter. Tyler struggled with this at first. He was accustomed to the laptop telling him where to look, and without it he felt, as he told Marcus one morning, like he was working in the dark. Marcus took to it more quickly. He had grown up on a farm in Colfax County and had fixed things with his father before he had ever touched a diagnostic computer, and the Saturday sessions reconnected something in him that the certification training had, without meaning to, trained out of him. By December, both of them had developed what Emmett called, without ceremony, the habit of starting from the beginning. The habit of starting from the beginning meant this: before you look at a fault code, you look at the circuit. Before you replace a component, you verify that the component has what it needs to function. You check power, you check ground, you check signal, in that order, every time. Not because the fault code is wrong, but because the fault code is downstream of the actual problem, and replacing what the fault code points to without verifying the upstream conditions is how you spend 11 days and $14,000 on a 40-cent problem. Now, let me tell you about Buck Crowley, because Buck Crowley had not forgotten the Farm Bureau meeting. Buck Crowley had, in fact, repeated his version of the story several times over the following months, at a manufacturer training seminar in Omaha in June, at a dealer conference in Kansas City in August, and at a county equipment show in October. His version of the story had evolved slightly in the retelling. In his version, the corroded ground strap was a one-time manufacturing defect that had been caught and addressed by a diligent dealership, and the lesson was that factory quality control needed to improve. The 67-year-old farmer with the flashlight did not appear in Buck Crowley's version of the story. The implication, in Buck Crowley's version, was that the system had worked. The dealership had identified the problem, the dealership had fixed it, the customer was satisfied. This was not exactly false. It was arranged in a way that made it true in the least informative possible sense. What Buck Crowley did not know, because he was not paying attention to the service bay at Garrett Sievert's dealership, was that the system Garrett was running had changed. Tyler and Marcus were finding faults faster. They were returning machines to customers in 3 days that would previously have taken 10. They were spending less on parts because they were replacing fewer parts that didn't need replacing. In the first 6 months after the Saturday sessions began, Garrett's parts return rate, the percentage of parts ordered and then returned unused because the actual fault was elsewhere, dropped from 31% to 8%. His average repair time on electrical faults dropped from 7.2 days to 3.1 days. Customer satisfaction scores, which the dealership tracked through a manufacturer survey, went up 14 points. None of this was because the diagnostic software had improved. The software was the same software. What had changed was that the technicians using it had learned to treat it as one tool among several rather than as the final word, and they had learned to verify physically what the software suggested diagnostically, and they had learned to start from the beginning. Let me tell you about the morning in April of 2021 when Buck Crowley drove into Garrett Sievert's dealership, because that morning is the reason this story is still being told. Buck had a problem. He had a customer, a large operation, nearly 3,000 acres, running 4 high-horsepower tractors and 2 combines, whose lead machine, a John Deere 8R410, had developed a fault in the hydraulic system that had resisted diagnosis for 9 days. Buck had sent the manufacturer's own field technical specialist, a man who worked directly for Deere and who had access to diagnostic tools that dealerships did not, and that specialist had been on site for 3 days and had replaced the hydraulic pump control valve, the load sense relief valve, and the electronic control unit for the hydraulic system at a combined parts cost of $18,700, and the fault persisted. The customer was threatening to call his attorney. Buck Crowley was, for the first time in 22 years as a territory manager, out of options. He did not come to ask for Emmett Huber. He came to ask Garrett Sievert whether he knew anyone who might be able to look at the machine. He phrased it carefully. He was looking for someone with broad diagnostic experience, someone who might have encountered unusual fault patterns. He did not say the name. But Garrett Sievert had been in this county for 6 years, and he knew who had broad diagnostic experience and who had encountered unusual fault patterns, and he picked up his phone and called Emmett Huber while Buck Crowley was still standing in the service bay. Emmett came the next morning. He drove his 1987 Ford to the large operations machine shed, which was 40 minutes from his farm, and he got out and walked around the 8R410 and looked at it for a while before he touched anything. Then he asked the operator to start the machine and demonstrate the fault. The fault was a loss of hydraulic pressure to the rear selective control valves under load. The hydraulics worked at low demand, but dropped off when the system was under high load, which was exactly when you needed them most. The electronic control unit for the hydraulic system was reading a fault in the load sense circuit. The diagnostic software attributed this to the load sense relief valve, which had been replaced. The fault persisted. Emmett asked for a hydraulic pressure gauge, not a digital one, a mechanical one with a needle. He connected it to the test port on the hydraulic pressure line and asked the operator to cycle the rear SCVs under load. The gauge needle moved correctly at low demand. Under high load, instead of holding steady, the needle oscillated. Not dropped, oscillated. Pressure was building and bleeding off rhythmically, about twice per second. Emmett watched the needle for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Your load sense line has an air bubble in it." The manufacturer's field specialist, who had been standing to the side watching with his arms crossed, said, "There's no air in the system. We bled it when we replaced the pump control valve." Emmett said, "You bled it at the pump. The load sense line runs from the SCV block back to the pump, and it's got a high point in the routing here." He pointed to a section of small diameter hydraulic line running over the top of the transmission housing. "And if you bleed at the pump, you don't necessarily pull the air out of the high point, especially if the line has any restriction at the fitting." He disconnected the load sense line at the high point, which required removing a sheet metal cover that had been installed at the factory and which showed no sign of having been removed before. He connected a short length of clear plastic tubing to the fitting and asked the operator to run the hydraulic system at low demand. A small bubble, not large, perhaps a centimeter, moved through the clear tubing and out. He reconnected the line. He asked the operator to cycle the rear SCVs under full load. The pressure gauge held steady. The fault code did not reappear. The repair had taken 45 minutes. The parts cost was zero. The $18,700 in components that had been replaced over the previous 9 days were all, as far as Emmett could determine, functioning correctly. They had been replaced because the diagnostic software had identified them as the fault location, and they had not been the fault location, and nobody had thought to bleed the load sense line at its high point because the diagnostic software had not suggested it, and because the factory bleed procedure did not specify it. Buck Crowley had driven out to the operation that morning. He was standing in the machine shed when Emmett packed up his tools. The two men had not spoken directly since the Farm Bureau meeting, though Buck had not known that Emmett knew what he'd said there. Emmett knew. Garrett had told him eventually, in the way that news travels in a county where everyone knows everyone, reluctantly and with apology. Emmett had not said much about it. He had, as was his way, filed it and moved on. Buck Crowley walked over to where Emmett was putting the pressure gauge back in its case. He was not a man who found humility easy, but he was standing in a machine shed where $18,700 in unnecessary parts had just been exposed as unnecessary by a man he had publicly dismissed as an anachronism. And whatever he was not stupid enough to pretend otherwise. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what I said at the Farm Bureau meeting." Emmett closed the case. He looked at Buck Crowley for a moment. His expression was the same expression it always was. Not warm, not cold, just present. "You said we shouldn't rely on whoever happens to walk in off the neighboring property," Emmett said. "That it wasn't a business model." Buck Crowley nodded. He had not expected the words back verbatim. He did not say anything. "You were right that it's not a business model," Emmett said. What I did isn't something you can put in a service menu, but the reason it works isn't because I'm special. It's because I start from the beginning. I ask what the system needs to function, and I check whether it has those things in order before I start replacing the parts the computer points at. That's not a personality trait. That's a method. You can teach it. He picked up his case. Garrett's been teaching it. He walked to his truck. He did not say anything else. He drove back to his farm. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in that machine shed. Garrett Sievert expanded the Saturday sessions. He brought in 2 more technicians, younger ones, fresh from technical college, and had Tyler and Marcus run the sessions, because by that point, Tyler and Marcus had internalized the method well enough to teach it. He reached out to 2 other dealerships in adjacent counties, both of whom had heard through the dealer network about the changes in his diagnostic outcomes, and he started a quarterly training day that rotated between the 3 shops. Emmett came to the first 2 of these and then declined further involvement, not because he was unwilling, but because, as he told Garrett, they didn't need him anymore. They had the method. The method was enough. Buck Crowley did not become a different person. He continued to sell precision equipment, continued to attend manufacturer training seminars, continued to sit in the front row at meetings. But something had shifted in the way he talked about diagnostic systems. He stopped saying, in the confident way he had said it for years, that the software would find it. He started saying, in a more careful way, that the software was a starting point. This was not a dramatic transformation. It was the kind of small correction that a man makes when he has been shown, clearly and without ambiguity, that his certainty was misplaced, and he is honest enough to adjust but too proud to announce the adjustment. It was, in its way, enough. Emmett Huber farmed his 640 acres through the 2019 season and the 2020 season and the 2021 season, and in the fall of 2022, he had a conversation with his son, a man named Gerald, who had farmed with him for 12 years and who had been quietly absorbing everything Emmett had learned in the same way Emmett had absorbed what his father had learned before him. Gerald was 39 years old and had his own ideas about the shop, about the collection of binders, about what to keep and what to update. He had been adding to the binder collection himself. Not paper manuals, because paper manuals were becoming harder to get, but printed PDFs, organized the same way, on the same shelves, because the organization was the point as much as the content. Emmett retired from active farming in the spring of 2023. He did not retire from the shop. He still went out there most mornings, still ran the 4-H equipment restoration program, still answered the phone when Garrett Sievert called with a fault that had resisted the software. He was 69 years old and had farmed the same 640 acres in Platte County for 43 years, and had rebuilt more engines and rewired more harnesses and diagnosed more electrical faults than he could count, and he had no intention of stopping any of it. Let me tell you one last thing, because it matters. Gerald Huber came to his father in the fall of 2023 with a proposal. He had been reading about machine learning diagnostic systems, not the current generation of diagnostic software, which was pattern matching against known fault codes, but the next generation, which was being developed to learn from repair histories and identify the upstream conditions that caused faults, not just the faults themselves. He had found a university extension program in Lincoln that was piloting one of these systems with a small group of dealerships, and he wanted to know whether Emmett thought Garrett Sievert should be part of the pilot. The system, as Gerald described it, would learn to ask the second question. Not just whether a component was functioning, but whether it had what it needed to function. It would, in other words, be trying to learn what Emmett had spent 41 years learning by hand. Emmett listened to all of this without interrupting. When Gerald finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Call Garrett." Gerald called Garrett. Garrett joined the pilot. The system, in its first 6 months, identified upstream fault conditions, ground resistance, harness chafe, thermal relay drift, hydraulic air entrainment, in 34% of cases where the standard diagnostic software had pointed to component failure. It was not perfect. It was not Emmett. But it was asking the second question, which was the question that mattered, and it was getting better at asking it with every repair it learned from. Emmett heard this and nodded. He was in his shop when Gerald told him the numbers. He was standing in front of the north wall, in front of the binders. 43 years of service manuals and wiring diagrams and engineering drawings organized in the way a man organizes things, when he believes that understanding how something is supposed to work is the only honest foundation for understanding why it stopped. He did not say that the machine learning system would replace what he knew. He did not say it wouldn't. He said, as long as it starts from the beginning. That is what he had always said. That is what his father had taught him. On a different machine in a different decade, in the same shop, on the same concrete pad. Start from the beginning. Ask what the system needs. Check whether it has those things. In order. Every time. Not because the fault code is always wrong, because the fault code is never the whole story, and the whole story is the only story worth knowing. The 837OR that started all of this is still running. Delmar Borgman put 1,400 hours on it in the 2 seasons after the repair and traded it in for a newer model in the fall of 2021. The corroded ground strap, the one that Emmett Huber found in 30 seconds with a flashlight and a thumbnail, was photographed by Tyler and printed out and taped to the wall of Garrett Sievert's service bay, next to a handwritten note that says, "Check power, check ground, check signal, in that order, every time." The binders on Emmett Huber's north wall, number 340 now. Gerald has started adding to them. The 4-H kids who come to the shop on Saturday mornings learn to read them before they touch a wrench. They learn to ask what the circuit is supposed to do before they ask what it has done wrong. They learn, in other words, to start from the beginning. That's what happens when you understand how something works. You stop being surprised when it breaks, and you stop being fooled by the machine that tells you what's broken without telling you why.